What's up folks, CrushSG back with a talking head video. Well, I guess in my case it's just a voiceover video with random gameplay footage in the background. You get what I mean. So with the popularity of Diablo 4 since launch, folks from all over are playing it. I'm sure some of you are in the same boat as I am, where you've never quite had so many friends playing the same game before. I have chat groups from other games now being completely taken over by Diablo 4 chatter, friends who aren't gamers or who don't play ARPGs wanting to try out the game, and with this huge influx of new players, as a Barbarian main, I very often have folks asking me if Barbs are worth trying because they had heard from someone somewhere that Barbs along with Druids are just terrible in the early game. So first off, we just got a rather large patch that buffed pretty much a bunch of skills for every class. The changes for Barbarians are relatively minor, but they are all buffs, so it helps the situation. Secondly, Barbs being bad at the start is a complete myth. Barbs aren't terrible in the early game at all. Now Druids, I don't know, maybe. The reason Barbs are often labeled as a bad early game class is because a vast majority of new Barbarian players make a few key mistakes while leveling up. And what do you know, I have just the video for that. Here are my top 10 mistakes that new Barbarian players should avoid that can negatively impact their early game experience. And by early game I'm referring to level 1 to 50, and if the response is good I might actually consider making a proper Barbarian leveling guide. Let me know in the comments if that's something that remotely interests you. Okay, let's dive straight into it. The first mistake to avoid would be over-relying or adhering too strictly to any given build guide that you might have access to. Two things. First, understand that almost all guides are written after the fact, rather than written in some sort of journal, level together with me format. As such, it is difficult even for the most self-aware content creator to remember every single step of the leveling process and every decision they made while leveling up. There is also a lot of summary and a lot of generalization that goes into making any guide. So even the most detailed leveling guides tend to miss out or gloss over certain things. The second thing is the Barbarian meta. The problem with Barbarians is regardless of what core skill you use, there is pretty much only one meta way to build a Barbarian at the moment. Not my Barbarian though, I don't use the meta build, but that's a story for a different video which happens to be on my channel by the way, so if you're interested you can check it out. Anyway, the Barbarian meta build literally doesn't work at all until it does. And what I mean by that is you need a whole bunch of optimized gear, sufficient Paragon points, and very specific aspects for the meta build to work. And many of these requirements are just flat out not accessible to a new or low level player. So we have one meta build covered by 90% of the hundreds or even thousands of Barbarian build guides on the internet. You are a new Barbarian player searching for a build guide, I'm sure you can see how that becomes a problem, right? The solution? There's nothing wrong with using a guide. By all means, read a few of them, but use them as their name suggests, as guides, not as complete templates to blindly copy. And if you are a brand new Barbarian player and the guide that you are using happens to have all three shouts on the skill bar and takes the Unbridled Rage or Gushing Wounds key passives, I don't care what the title of the guide is, look for another one because that build is probably not going to work for you yet. Okay, mistake number 2. Avoid hyper-focusing on your core skills while ignoring everything else. It is a great thing that Diablo 4 made the decision to give us access to a lot of the iconic skills so early on in the game. However, this can cause many players to hyper-focus on just their core skills and ignore the wide range of other abilities that Barbarians have at their disposal. Core skills do not scale well at lower levels, so it's almost always better to invest into other skills to fill out your bar first. Now you still want to max the core skills out eventually. All I'm saying is that shouldn't take precedence over getting other skills on your skill bar. And here are a few suggestions for good skills to use while leveling. Iron Skin with the healing node is probably one of the biggest lifesavers in the early game when you haven't unlocked all 9 potion slots. It can literally double your effective health pool and reduce your need to pot in a vast majority of encounters. Rallying Cry does wonders for Fury generation, and it provides the unstoppable buff. Ground Stomp gives an AoE stun and Fury generation. Challenging Shout gives a huge damage reduction buff and a decent amount of Fury generation if you spec into the appropriate node. And finally we have Death Blow, which is, in my opinion, probably the best damage skill to use while leveling up. It costs no Fury, it does massive damage, it is weapon type neutral, and it resets its cooldown on kill. And it can be spec'd to either give you berserking or generate Fury itself. So consider getting some of these skills before dumping all your points into your core skill. Alright, the third mistake to avoid is focusing on the wrong attributes in the early game. Now everyone knows that the stat priorities in Diablo 4 are crit damage, vulnerable damage, followed by basically everything else, because multiplicative stats are king, right? Are they really though? For vulnerable damage, sure, with the right passive allocations, Barbarians can get access to very reliable vulnerable uptime relatively early on in the game via a combination of, say, Pressure Point or the Exposed Vulnerability passives. But the same can't be said for crit damage. Crit chance is hard to come by at lower levels, and the Codex version of Dire Whirlwind gives a pitifully low amount of crit chance even if put on a two-handed weapon. So do we really want to be chasing crit damage as a leveling stat? My answer would be no. On the other hand, as a Barbarian, you're almost always dealing exclusively physical damage, and you are always close to targets that you hit because we are a melee class. So it is the unconditional stats like these that you should focus on in the early game. If you reliably bleed targets because maybe you use a two-handed sword, you can add damage to bleeding targets to this list. And if you also then have 1 point into the hamstring passive, you can now add damage to slowed targets or damage to crowd control targets to the list as well. So focus on the right stats for your level and you'll spend more time killing and less time, I don't know, giving enemies a back massage or whatever. Okay, on to mistake number 4, and that would be picking an ultimate skill way too early. Ultimate skills are typically on a 1 minute cooldown and last for at most 10 seconds. Now the new patch buffed Call of the Ancients and Iron Maelstrom, and they are a little bit better now, but it doesn't really change my opinion that Barbarian ultimate skills generally don't confer enough of a benefit to warrant the 3 skill points and the 1 skill slot that they demand from a sub-level 50 player. The one exception to this rule is Call of the Ancients with the Ancestral Echoes aspect. That is actually pretty decent at low levels. The bottom line is, instead of making a beeline for an ultimate skill, you might be better off investing more points into other skills somewhere lower in your passive tree, and then jumping straight to getting one of your key passives. And speaking of key passives, we have the 5th mistake, which is picking Unbridled Rage or Gushing Wounds too early. Gushing Wounds faces the same problem as crit damage. It relies on your crit chance, so picking this key passive while you have a low crit chance is just a waste of a key passive because it basically does nothing for you. And then we have Unbridled Rage, which is possibly the most widely used key passive in almost every non-bleed based Barbarian build. It looks epic on paper, and it certainly becomes pretty epic in the late game, but you really don't want to be picking this up if you don't have sufficient Fury generation or Fury cost reduction. And prior to level 50 or 60, you are almost never going to have enough Fury generation or Fury cost reduction. So Unbridled Rage should never be taken pre-level 50. Instead, I would recommend that you go for Walking Arsenal. It is the safest bet because it costs absolutely nothing. It always gives you some sort of damage boost regardless of what you're doing, from a minimum of 10% to a maximum of 53% multiplicative damage. Just be sure to assign different weapon types to all your skills because that's a requirement for Walking Arsenal. Okay, moving on, we have mistake number 6, and that is not taking the time to unlock key aspects at lower levels. Aspects play a huge role in your potential character power, and many of these aspects are unlockable via the Codex if you complete the respective dungeon associated with it. The world in Diablo 4 scales with your level, so you don't really need to worry about being under-leveled for any given dungeon. Also, clicking the aspect in the codex pins the location of the dungeon on your map, regardless of whether you've discovered the area or not. So it is worth sometimes going out of your way just to unlock an important aspect to your build, because having these aspects can give you significant boosts in damage or survivability. Okay, mistake number 7 would be not updating your gear regularly as you level up. A lot of new players to Diablo 4, they get blinded by the joy of finding their first few legendaries. Because, legendary item, right, has to be good. And then you rush to equip it, and you keep these legendaries equipped for way too many levels. Well, what you need to know about legendaries in Diablo 4 they are nothing more than rare items or yellow items with an aspect on them. So if that aspect is useless to you, you are basically left with just a regular rare item, and if that rare item is in turn not very useful, well then that entire legendary item is basically useless. Don't use it, replace it, salvage it, sell it, or extract the aspect. And this ties in to mistake number 8. And that is prioritizing the wrong upgrades when you do actually upgrade your gear. Now this is more of an issue with weapon upgrades than armor upgrades, but it is worth mentioning that armor as a stat is not useless. It is one of the biggest sources of damage reductions you can get. So pay attention to armor drops that you get as you level up. It's not just about the attributes. Barbs are a melee class, don't ignore large gains in armor. Now, raw weapon DPS on the other hand is almost always going to give you a bigger damage boost than attributes will. So if you find a weapon that has a lot more DPS than your current one but maybe has less attributes or maybe doesn't have any useful attributes, stop for a second before you trash it. Maybe equip it and try it out. You might be surprised that you are missing out on a potential huge damage upgrade. Moving on to mistake number 9, and this is somewhat related to mistake number 1. And that is being generally unwilling to experiment with different builds at low levels. Now, Diablo 4 is explicitly designed with low respec costs at low levels. This is meant to facilitate experimentation at will, changing builds and all that. Make use of this feature while you are at a lower level to get a feel for all the skills the Barbarian has to offer. You might discover something that you like more than whatever any given guide recommends. Swapping stuff around is really not something you want to be doing repeatedly at higher levels. Yes, I know this is one of those do what I say and not what I do situations, because I personally change builds almost every other day and I'm level 100. What can I say? I like to experiment and it also provides content. But this also means I need to farm materials and gold for a couple of hours a day just to be able to facilitate this experimentation. So unless you have 2 or 3 or more hours available to you daily, you probably want to keep the experimenting to the lower levels. And now for the final mistake, mistake number 10, and what I feel is possibly the biggest mistake newer players can make while leveling up. And that is not upgrading your gear at the blacksmith or the jeweler whenever you get the chance. Now during the first couple of weeks post-launch, the majority of the first wave of build guides and leveling guides from content creators tended to recommend that you avoid wasting resources upgrading your gear at lower levels. And this has to be one of the biggest mistakes you can make as a new player. Even I made that mistake for a while and just hoarded my materials. 2 things to remember. Upgrading at least 2 levels costs virtually nothing, but it tends to confer a decent boost in stats. Subsequently, salvaging an item returns more materials the higher the upgrade level of the item was. So it is not exactly all going to waste if you upgrade most of the items you get. So don't be afraid to just go to the blacksmith or the jeweler and instantly 2-tap every new upgrade that you find, and maybe consider 3-tapping the really good ones. This can make a big difference to your damage output and survivability, and in turn it makes your whole leveling experience generally a whole lot better. Alright folks, so that concludes my top 10 mistakes to avoid as a new Barbarian player. I hope this was helpful to some of you. Thumbs if you liked it, and I'll catch you guys later.